Hello. Wherever you are in the world today, thank you for joining us for the Rise Traveler, unpacking conversations of sustainable travel. We're here to move a step beyond the Instagram-ready world of travel and think critically and deeply about how travel can uplift global communities, protect natural ecosystems, and be a source of growth for travelers. Here at Rise Travel Institute, we are committed to empowering travelers and travel professionals through education. Our programs, research, experiential journeys, scholarships, and free resources are all aimed at bringing you closer to a more responsible and ethical travel experience. Learn more by visiting risetravelinstitute.org.
Welcome to Rise Travel Institute's podcast, The Rise Traveler, Unpacking Conversations of Sustainable Travel. I'm Vincie Ho, the guest host for Season 4. In this special season, we'll be talking to critical theory scholars and activists and leaders in sustainability and social and environmental justices in the travel and tourism space. And together, we'll delve into the ethics of travel and discuss some of the pressing issues that are impacting communities at travel destinations around the world. Today, we're so fortunate to have our honorable guest, Dr. Gada Mahrouse. Gada is Associate Professor at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, Concordia University in Montreal, where she teaches and researches in the areas of critical race studies, cultural studies, transnational feminist, and post and decolonial theories. Her first book, entitled Conflicted Commitments, Race, Privilege, and Power in Transnational Solidarity Activism, focuses on the challenges of solidarity across asymmetrical power racialized relations. Her research expertise is obviously in tourism and forced migration, which is today's conversation focus. Gada, thank you so much for coming on our podcast.
I'm so delighted to be here, Vincie. I've been looking forward to it for a while. We had to reschedule a few times, but we're finally here.
I know. I've been looking forward to this conversation as well. So just a little bit about how Gada and I met. We met at the Critical Tourism Studies North America Conference in August 2023, when I think the conference was in Montreal, and Gada was one of the co-organizers. Gada, would you tell our listeners what that conference is about and what Critical Tourism Studies is about?
Sure. Yes. So the Critical Tourism Studies Association is an international network of scholars who share a vision of producing and promoting social change in and through tourism practice, research, and education. And as you said, the conference we met at was the North America chapter of it. And the conference was mostly, I played a small role. It was mostly organized by my colleague, Dominique Lapointe, who teaches at the University of Quebec in Montreal. I'm so glad I met you there, because that's when I first learned about RISE. And as you know, since then, I've started to incorporate the work that you do into my teaching. And I should also say many thanks for inviting me to the fabulous forum in Atlanta last summer that you co-organized with Wes Espinoza of CREST. I really felt so privileged to have been invited and to have had the opportunity to learn from all those amazing speakers. And I'm not just saying this because I'm on your podcast. I really have so much respect for your vision and what the two of you are doing in CREST and RISE and the impact that you're having on the tourism industry. It really gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Gada, for saying that. It was our privilege to have you among our distinguished panelists at that conference. So for those who are not aware of that particular conference, that conference was actually the World Tourism Day Forum, organized by the Center for Responsible Travel. RISE was a co-organizer, and that conference last year focused on tourism justice and peace. which is a topic that unfortunately not many tourism conferences address. So yeah, we're just like really excited to have been able to gather so many scholars and practitioners who really care about social justice and environmental justice within our industry. So thank you so much for being that important voice. And yeah, so one question I am curious about, Simone de Beauvoir Institute that you're working at is a feminist institute. Can you tell us a little bit about the mission of the institute and how your program fits in the larger mission of the institute?
Sure. Yes. So, as you said in when you were reading my bio, I am an associate professor there, and I've been there for 17 years.
Wow.
Um, I'd like to add that Concordia University, where I teach, is on unceded Indigenous lands, and that the Kanyankehaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of these lands. So
Mm,
I just like to offer this acknowledgement first out of respect for my Indigenous colleagues who've asked us to make such statements.
mm,
But I do so with the clear recognition that on its own it's meaningless. So I see it more as a starting point, and I
mhm,
like to qualify my land acknowledgements by recommitting each time to making colonization a key consideration in the work that I do.
sure.
So, having said that, yes, it's the Simone de Beauvoir Institute is a feminist research and teaching institute, but there too, I like to offer a clarification because often when people hear feminist institute, they assume all the work that we do focuses on women.
Mhm,
And of course, we do focus on women, but that's not all that we do. And I personally define feminism as a philosophical and political orientation that seeks to dismantle inequities and injustice. So it goes way beyond
mhm.
questions of gender. It's gender as it interlocks with questions of race, colonialism, etc. And in fact, as you saw in my bio, my work mostly focuses on issues of race and anti-colonial frameworks.
That's right. And so let's dive a little bit more into your research. And so I saw that your recent research really delves into the intersection of tourism and refugee or migration or forced migration studies. And I was really intrigued when I first met you. I was so glad to hear your presentation on the nexus between tourism and forced migration. The refugee issue is very close to my heart personally, as I've also worked with refugees in the past. And when you think about where I'm from in Hong Kong, I would say that like two generations before me, my grandparents' generations, they many of them, we had a big population of refugees from China. And so this topic is really, really close to my heart. And I would love for you to share a little more about the kind of research you do exactly in this realm, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Um, yes, so it's very close to my heart too. And it's a bit of a longish story because as you could see again from the bio, I've been interested in questions of travel for a long
Mhm,
time. But for me, the overarching question has always been, what do differently racialized bodies signify when they cross international borders? And the book that you mentioned, my earlier research, that explored anti-war or anti-violence activists who travel for humanitarian reasons.
mhm,
So these are people who very literally use their white privilege, their white bodies, and their passports in solidarity. And
Mm,
I examined that, how being white and having a Canadian or US or European citizenship enables them to do that work. And then since then, I've studied a few different types of tourism, ethical, sometimes in quotation marks, educational tourism, and a
mhm,
few other, niche types of tourism. But then in 2016, when the so-called refugee crisis was declared, largely as a result of the ongoing civil war in Syria, my interest shifted to migration and refugees, especially how they were being represented in the media. And this shift was professional in the sense that it extended the questions I was already working with, but it was also personal because my background is Syrian and the situation directly impacted my family there. So
mm.
that changed my work significantly. And I started to immerse myself in scholarly associations that focus on refugees and migrants to learn about the field.
Thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, I was going to ask if you had any personal connections to this particular topic that you're so passionate about. And you just used the term so-called refugee crisis. I
Yes.
want to delve a little bit more into that because I personally understand why you use that term, but it would be really beneficial for you to explain a little bit we why the word crisis is problematic to our listeners.
Sure, yes. So the way it's communicated, especially in, global media,
Yes.
um, by referring to it as a refugee crisis, the implication is that refugees are coming, and this is a problem. They're causing a problem for us. So this is what crisis tends to be associated with, whereas some critical thinkers and scholars have um, challenged that notion to instead refer to it as a humanitarian crisis, which I
Mhm.
think is a much more accurate and better term.
Thank you. And so this now we're talking about 2020, well, now we are in 2025, and the refugee situation, the global forced migration situation has only exacerbated in the last in the last 14 months or so.
Yes,
And then at the same time, we also see that tourism destinations are reacting to, or like, residents at tourism destinations are reacting to the influx of tourists into their homes. And so we would see graffiti and artwork saying tourists go home and refugees welcome. Can you
yes.
elaborate a little bit more about what you observe on that front in terms of people's reaction to tourists and refugees and all the and also like government policies and the evolution of government policies in the past few years?
Sure, yes. So once I started getting into refugee and migration studies, I realized that that field of research or study shares a lot of similar concerns as tourism studies, right? There's some really interesting and important overlaps, and yet these two fields rarely speak to one another.
That's right.
And so, in a way, that's what makes, in a way, that's what sets me apart from a lot of my colleagues, because in a sense, I have one foot in critical tourism studies and another in critical refugee and migration studies. But when I started to be interested in how these two come together, I looked for scholarly examples, and at the time there weren't many. There weren't many
Mhm.
people there. That's changing now, which is
Mhm.
great. But at the time, about 2016, it was mainly activism and artists that were thinking about this issue of the
Mhm.
intersection of refugees and migrants. And so that kind of graffiti that you mentioned, I first encountered it in Barcelona, which
Right.
is, of course, so over touristed. And I wasn't there to do research. I was just there traveling. And when I saw that, it was quite, confronting.
Mm.
Tourists go home, but refugees welcome. It was such an interesting juxtaposition. And so I started to look more in that sort of realm of activism and artist um, work. And that's where I found most of the interesting initial thinking on this topic was happening. And, I'm an academic, so I can say that's often the case. Academics often lag behind you know, the artists and the activists. So, yes, that tourists go home, refugees welcome, and there's many iterations of that all around
That's
Europe.
right.
That was a really interesting example, but I've since seen several others that I can talk about if you'd like.
Yeah, sure, please do. I'm
Okay,
very curious about more examples about
okay,
how residents are reacting to some like to very different types of migrants, just like or two very different types of migration. Some people like if, when you talk about tourism, it's also one sort of, especially right now when digital nomadism is encouraged everywhere.
yes,
They are staying much longer in a destination, and so in a sense, it's also a type of migration, like temporary migration, but voluntary, definitely. So like it's interesting to me that it's just very interesting to see how residents are reacting to different types of migrants, right?
yes.
Yeah.
So I'd like to speak to that, to residents, but also to tourists, like
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily residents, but people who are there for leisure,
Yeah.
people holidaying, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So unfortunately, the reactions are often hostile.
Mm,
Um, Tourists are seen or represented as being in competition with migrants for,
mm,
in certain places, which is quite, surprising, I think. So yes, so another example of what you were talking about. Again, it came up in a photography exhibit that I came across. It was circulating in mainstream media, and it too kind of contrasted the refugee crisis with the world of leisure and tourism.
mm,
So, for
mm-hmm,
example, you'd see in one photographic frame a dark-skinned, clearly a refugee person, alongside a white tourist strolling on a
mm-hmm,
beach in a
mm-hmm,
bathing suit. So I don't know if you remember seeing these kinds of images. There was one photo essay, in particular by Jorg Brueggemann. He called it Tourist versus Refugees, and he took these photographs in Kos, Greece.
mm-hmm,
And this was in 2015, and you see, is the glaring differences, but also a lot of the very inhospitable ways that refugees were being uh, responded to.
Yeah. Yeah, I still remember traveling to Greece in 2018 to meet with Kara Martinez, who is the founder of Love Without Borders for Refugees in
Yes.
Need, that whom you met as well at the conference at the World Tourism Day Forum in Atlanta. She's a very good friend of mine, and she has been leading this amazing refugee empowerment project in Greece. And I was just having this conflicted feeling as well, as a tourist in
Mhm.
Greece. But then, of course, the trip wasn't meant to be like a pleasure seeking trip. The trip was really to meet with her and her community of refugees to discuss projects and collaborations. But then, as you said, like, as a traveler there, also observing, thousands and tens of thousands of tourists going to the same islands when refugees arriving onto this island by boat. And, there were capsized boats and there were a lot of casualties almost regularly, right? And so it was the difference between what people were experiencing, arriving on those islands was just really striking to me.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I was just really, really inspired by your presentation at the Critical Tourism Studies conference when you were talking about the intersection between, I mean, the stark contrast between the treatment of, tourists and refugees at destinations and the
Mhm.
perception of them by people. And
That's right.
so, yeah, a little bit about teaching critical tourism studies to undergraduates. So, we talked a little bit about your research. Now, I want to move on to Ted more about what you teach. And what are you working with undergraduate students and
Yes,
postgraduate students as well, right?
that's right.
That's
Yes.
right. And
So,
so, yeah,
sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
please, yeah, no, please share a little bit about that.
Yes, so I developed a course many years ago on critical tourism studies and how relations of power emerge in tourism and how tourism impacts just about everything, the environment, the culture, the economy. So that was a great course. But what I noticed right from the start, and that was consistent every year I taught it, was that, and this in this case, I'm talking about undergraduates who are, um, on average 19, let's say, 19 years old. Um, I could see, discomfort. I could see, a bit uncertainty about how this was going to go. And so right from the get-go, I make sure to say this isn't a place of judgment. This
Mhm.
course isn't about judging you if you go during your spring break to an all-inclusive, that's that's not the point. The point isn't to say, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad tourism. The point is simply to observe how relations of power come up in tourism and also therefore how they can be contested.
Mhm.
So yeah, so I try to, in some ways just manage their their concerns. And I understand it too, like you just said, when you were in Greece, like it's increasingly hard to justify certain
Mhm.
types of tourism, and we have guilt around it, and that's not just internal. There's a lot of travel shaming that is
Yeah.
happening.
Mhm.
So for it to be a learning environment, an environment that's conducive to thinking, the first thing is to take away element of judgment. Um, so that course has been really wonderful, and I think it really opened up the eyes of my students because, as you know, tourism is often regarded as frivolous. So why study it? You know, it's just about people going on holiday.
Mm,
It's not a serious topic. So when we explore when I explore with them just how serious these
mm,
topics are, it's kind of quite eye-opening. But again, just like as I explained with my research, that course preceded my interest in refugees and migration. So when that happened, when I started to be interested in that as alongside tourism, I started incorporating that. So the course was no
mm.
longer simply about tourism; it was now about mobilities
Mhm,
and who has the right to travel, who doesn't, who has the right to stay home, etc. So we talk a
mhm.
lot about questions of forced migration,
Right.
and we juxtapose those with tourism.
I love that. And so now you're more focused on talking about mobility. And you mentioned once a framework called Mobility Justice Framework. Could you share with us what it means exactly?
Sure. So it's a framework that I've cobbled together, drawing from some very brilliant thinkers who over the years have talked about this. So some of them are transnational feminists
Mhm,
who've long been talking about this, but more recently, there's one scholar in particular named Mimi Scheller who published a book called Mobility Justice, and that offers a good framework for the kinds of questions I'm asking, because it needed to go beyond tourism and beyond migration. I needed something that brought both together. And so that framework I have found most useful and applicable. And within that is a critical refugee framework as well.
got
And I
it.
should clarify that the mobility justice framework that Mimi Scheller writes about is much broader than what I'm doing. I mean, it covers things like transportation and non-human movements, etc. So I just take from that the aspects that are particular to my interest, which is very much about human travel and travel across borders in particular.
Thank you. And I would like to piggyback on what you just shared previously about travel shaming. I really appreciate your approach to help students navigate your course and as a way to manage their guilt and making sure that they are um, helping them to ease into that discomfort when they are confronted with more serious discussions about tourism. And so last year, as you know, we saw in the news a lot about residents reacting to tourists or be and like with certain degree of hostility because of over tourism. Residents have had enough, and then we in the industry we see a lot of travel shaming as well, right? And so what would you say to someone who is making a remark on travelers who continue to travel? Because I know that there are activists, for example, who are in the environmental or like climate justice realm, and they have stopped traveling altogether because they understand the impact of their travels, especially air travels on the planet. What would you say to people who travel shame others?
Well, for me, it's really such an individual choice, and it's a process.
Hmm.
Um, my students, let's say at the end of the course, some may decide I'm not going to travel by plane anymore, for
Hmm.
example.
Hmm.
And great, good for them. But others might try something else. Others may not do anything. And, that's their choice as well. I don't like heavy-handed, imposed again, judgmental, like this is right
Yeah,
and this is wrong. I think it's not so much if we travel, it's how we travel. In my
exactly.
case, my own personal journey, I traveled a lot when I was younger, and I didn't have this critical awareness. I felt entitled. And over the years, as I became way more self-conscious about what it means to enter a place that's not yours as a foreigner, with a passport and with money. I have since made sometimes difficult choices about where I'll travel
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
So, yeah,
yeah.
so I guess I would really encourage people to allow this process to unfold
Hmm.
because awareness is growing. We're becoming so much more aware of the negative impacts that we might have, whether it's environmental or cultural. And so any change that individuals choose to implement is a step. It's a step
Yeah.
forward. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for explaining that so beautifully. Um, as you were talking about how you evolved into a more critical and more mindful traveler, I mean, I'm sure that this resonates with a lot of listeners in our community, including myself, right? Like when we were younger, we traveled without paying much attention to our impact. And and so this definitely is a journey.
Mhm.
And we are just at, similarly at Rise, what we are trying to do is not to tell people what not to do, but really helping people think critically and then make their own choices. And I think really the role of education is not to shame, but to offer that opportunity for deeper inquiry and critical thinking. So thank you so much for answering that question beautifully. And so the next thing that I would love to ask you share is what are some community efforts that you would like to share with our listeners in terms of refugee empowerment in the tourism space?
Um, so you probably are aware of a few different examples that, are popular examples of community efforts. So I know I think you did a podcast on
Yeah,
Hotel
that's right.
Magdas in Vienna.
Yes,
Yes. So
that's
so
correct.
that's a really interesting example. And what I like about that is that it's very concrete in material ways. It employs
Yeah.
refugees or migrants. So
Hmm.
that is really significant because that's what they need. That's what they're searching for more than anything else is
That's right.
employment. There's also a canal cruise tour in Amsterdam. I don't know if you've heard about that, and I'm not even sure if it's still going on, but this was a cruise tour through the canals of Amsterdam that was guided by refugees
Mm.
on boats that were previously used to
Wow.
cross the Mediterranean.
Wow, this is so powerful. I did
Yes,
not expect
yes.
that. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So they kind of repurpose these boats and render them safe because very often they're not even safe. And so people have that experiential um, you know being on the boat. That experience is quite I think profound.
Right.
I, yeah,
Ooh. Yeah,
yes,
just imagining that is giving me
yes,
oof,
yeah.
goosebumps.
Um, But that said, I'd be remiss to not also articulate some of my concerns
Mhm.
about some of these interventions, some of these initiatives. So, for example, there are, refugee voices kind of walking tours.
Yes.
And I haven't done research on this, but at a glance, I mean, they leave me very cautiously optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm not sure that all of these efforts succeed in really transforming attitudes. And I say that because, let's say that example, and I'm not thinking of one in particular, but these kinds of initiatives, of course, the intentions behind them are great, right? The idea is, to meet refugees, to understand them, to see that they're just like us, etc. But it worries me a bit that in those cases, I suspect the refugees, the guides, have to narrate their experiences in a particular way that's enjoyable, right? It has to
Mm-hmm.
be done in a way, it's in a way packaged and staged, so that it's agreeable to those participating, like, because it's still a tour, it's still
Mm-hmm.
people who are traveling, who are participating in this. So it's kind of turns the refugee experience into a leisure activity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's something about touristifying
Right.
migrant experience that I think just raises some question marks. I think we need to, think critically about those. Because I don't like to see refugees, let's say in this case, or migrants. I use these terms interchangeably, by the way. I don't like to see to think of them in positions where they have to persuade those in
Right.
privilege of their humanity.
Mm-hmm.
It might work on an individual basis, like on a one-to-one, but it's not going to really change attitudes in a significant way. But again, every little bit helps, and this definitely requires a multi-pronged efforts.
Yeah.
So it's not a criticism per se. It's more an invitation to dig a little
Mm.
deeper and think about what these types of efforts do and what they don't do.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's an important critical lens to look at that. You use the term touristifying migrant
Mm.
experiences, and I'm very intrigued in going on one of these walking tours and actually see how they are conducted and what kind of messages and framing are being communicated on those tours. So thank you for that. And your example just gave me just let me to thinking tourists visiting refugee camps. And that's obviously, and there's a lot of ethical questions to raise about that. And so if someone comes to you and say, "Oh, I really want to help refugees, and I've signed up for a volunteer program in Greece or in Turkey," what would you say to that person if they have like all the good intentions? What would be some foreseeable implications that you could share with that person?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it's also a very big question. And we're talking about it in the context of a refugee camp, but I think, there are echoes of what you're asking in slum tours, for
Mm,
example. There's
that's
been
right.
lot of great writing on that. And just volunteer tourism in general. Sometimes it can be very superficial.
Mm,
Sometimes it can do more harm than good.
yeah.
Sometimes it's just meaningless, I should say. And so, what we've learned, what the research has taught us, is that when these efforts are helpful, when they're meaningful, the volunteers are there long term.
Hmm.
First of all, it can't be a fly in and out. Like the people who just add an afternoon, tour. I don't think of that as volunteer work. I think of that as, a bit voyeuristic, to be honest. I mean,
Yeah.
I know they're initiated often by the people who live in the camps, and so whether it's to generate funds or whatever,
Hmm.
there's reasons why people offer these that I'm not questioning, but I
Hmm.
just I know that when people have had truly significant impacts as volunteers in certain settings, it's because they've learned the language,
Hmm.
they've immersed themselves, meaningfully, like long term, not just for a short period of time. And most importantly, and this is what my earlier research was about, you follow the lead of the residents, of the
Yeah.
locals, because
Yeah.
so many of these are organized by
Mm,
people who aren't even in these camps, tour operators
yeah.
who you know who aren't really affected one way or the other of how this goes. So yeah, it's, as I said, it's a big question. There's some excellent work on this by a Brazilian scholar about the favelas in Brazil that I think resonates very much with the context we're talking about.
Thank you so much for the recommendation. For our listeners who haven't yet checked out our flagship program, in fact, in our flagship certificate program, we do have a session on volunteerism and the impact of and the ethical implications of volunteerism. So definitely check that out.
Yes.
And okay, well, we've talked a lot, and we've talked about so many different things in terms of your research and how you approach these topics with your students. How do you help your students navigate these? And so I would, um, by extending what you do with your students, would you say that, or like, what would you say that tourists should be concerned about? Or why should tourists be concerned about migrants and refugees when they're traveling, and what can they do?
Mhm.
Any like practical tips on like for travelers who really want to support migrants? What are some things that they can do when they're traveling?
Um, I mean, this is going to sound kind of um, maybe extreme, but I would love to see tourists advocating for open borders. And
Hmm.
I think as tourists, you're well positioned to do that. Um, so let me answer your question a bit indirectly by
Hmm.
talking about returning to my course and my students. So one of the things I do right away is I ask them has anyone, have any of you ever lost or misplaced your passport? And invariably, some people have. And I try to sort of hone in on the panic, on the
Mhm.
vulnerability, that feeling. And if it's even vaguely relatable, I think it might create empathy for those without documents, right? And
Mm,
just how vulnerable that makes them.
mm.
And this is, in the cases of traveling by choice. So if
Yeah.
you add to it traveling, not because you want to, but because you're forced to, how much more difficult that is. And I also, tourism, as you know, because you've devoted, so much of your work to the topic, can be so enriching. And as tourists, anyone who's traveled, I think, knows when we're made to feel wanted and welcome. And most of us, I think, have had the experience of being unwanted, right? In some way, we've had interactions with locals who, didn't necessarily like us being there, or a lot, some kind of maybe hostility or even
Yeah.
indifference.
Or
And so,
even,
yeah,
as soon as we enter a as soon as we enter a country, the first people like immigration officers, who
yes,
greet us into the country. Yeah. I mean, I definitely
yes.
have felt being unwanted for sure.
Exactly. So I like to tap into that. I tap into that feeling. It's an awful feeling, right? To feel unwelcome and unwanted. And again, and that's when we're there by choice.
Mm,
So I encourage students to imagine how it feels when you're not there by choice and how distressing it is to feel unwelcome in a place that you have to be in. And and the reverse, of course, how a helpful response in a place where, let's say, you don't speak the language. Oh my gosh, that means so much, right? And that's a relatable thing, I think, for most of us who've traveled. So I think travel helps us to understand what an extraordinary experience it is to go somewhere, to feel wanted, to feel safe. And so that's why I think tourists, are well positioned to advocate for
mhm.
migrants, for, yes, border
I love
policies.
I
Yeah.
love that. And so concretely, in an increasingly polarized world with rising authoritarianism, looking at what's going on in the United States right now, how do we, how can we advocate for open borders when we're fighting, when we're fighting an administration that is actually doing the opposite? In your
Mhm.
opinion, what can we do?
Oh, it's not an easy time, that's for sure. I I'm heartened by efforts that are happening at the community level.
Mm,
I read about uh, community groups or volunteers or individuals, let's say in San Diego, who
mhm.
who go and put water in
Yeah,
places where
that's
migrants
right.
walk across the border, and provide food and just, sometimes shelter them in their homes.
Mm.
Like, these are the things that I think give me hope in these difficult times. So there's a lot of humanity out there. There's a lot of people who care about others. And yeah, the I think it's yeah, it's those, I think, experiences that will help us to see the dangers of what we're witnessing right now around the world, but certainly in the US.
And the humanity and the resilience that we all have when we come together to fight that. Thank you so much.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
yeah. So we are we're coming close to the end of this interview, and I still have two questions for you. They're pretty big ones. um, the first one is, what does decolonizing travel mean to you? You know that at Rise Travel Institute, we care a lot the about raising awareness about the legacy of tourism and also the effects of neocolonialism
Mhm.
on places around the world, and especially on vulnerable communities. So, what I know that you also in your research, you also work a lot on post and decolonial theories, right? And so, what would you say about how we should decolonize our travels as travelers? And what does that actually mean?
Well, I think the very first thing is to situate any movement, migration, travel, within the ongoing impacts and processes of colonization or neocolonization, as you said. Um, and, we don't necessarily all realize that the issues we're talking about are really processes that date back to European colonial expansion
Yeah.
when borders were imposed to create nation states on indigenous lands. So, I mean, that's a starting point, and that's not even, that's not evident, right? That
Mm,
you never really hear about that. It's just kind of taken for granted that we're
mhm,
crossing, this border to this country and this border to that country. So I use what I refer to as like a concept of denaturalizing. So
mm,
denaturalizing these ideas of borders, and to do that, you really have to understand the that the basic part of American and Canadian nation building required the restriction of movement for
mm,
Indigenous people.
mm,
So for us to be able to travel, other people had to be forced in place, right?
mhm,
Or forced
mhm.
to certain places. So that's really important to know. And settler colonialism, as you know, has made Indigenous people foreigners on their own land. So their
Yeah.
rights to move and their rights to their own land are continued to be inferior to those
Mm.
of, especially European settler migrants. So I draw, again, I'm an academic, so I rely on the thinking of experts in those fields, and I draw a lot from scholars and activists who connect mobility justice to
Mm.
decolonization and to Indigenous solidarity.
Wow, thank you so much. This is a lot to process and
Yes,
a lot to dig in. I would definitely look up denaturalizing, the term denaturalizing the
yes,
ideas of borders, and this is very, very helpful. And I love when you said that settler colonialism has made indigenous people foreigners on their own lands. This line is super powerful, and I think people need to be aware, as you said, now like we're socialized into a world that has already been set up by colonialism, and like a lot of travelers are not thinking about these things. They're not thinking about their relationship to the land that they're traveling to, and the government of the country that is that is controlling the land that we're visiting. So this is so important. It is so important for us to actually be aware of how our world is currently set up, and why, why certain communities are still being marginalized and minoritized in our times. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that. The last question that I have for you is, what is the legacy you want to leave behind? And this is a question that we ask all of our guests coming onto our podcast.
Yikes, that is a big question. I feel so fortunate about the work that I do because I feel like I can make small differences. And so I guess the my legacy will hopefully be having challenged some thinking, opened up some students' eyes to injustices, but also, and most importantly, inciting people to try to make change, to do social change. And I say that because again, I'm in a fortunate position of influence, right? I can
Mhm.
help people get there with teaching, with you know, uh, s- uh, uh, suggesting certain readings to them, etc. And I know that many of my students do go on to do incredible community activist work and also professional work. So I think incremental social change.
I'm sure that you have already made so much influence and positive influence on people's lives, your students' lives, who then become the change makers and address be a part of addressing social injustices. So thank you so much for your work. And I think this is what you just said really resonated with me. And I think that's why yeah, that's probably why we feel so aligned and in terms of our
Yeah.
work and also our personal convictions. So thank you so much, Gada, for today's chat. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure that our community would as well. So this brings us to the end of our journey today. If you liked what you heard and would like to hear more, please subscribe, like, and comment. You can follow us at risetravelinstitute.org or at Rise Travel Institute on Facebook and Instagram. Here at the Rise Travel Institute, we believe travel is a powerful tool for positive, transformative change. If you're a college student planning a study abroad trip, a professional thinking about that gap year or sabbatical, or anyone who's currently traveling the world and wants to understand how to travel in a more sustainable, responsible, and ethical way, we do encourage you to head to risetravelinstitute.org for more information on our educational resources. We'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, keep roaming, keep learning, and continue to be a Rise Traveler.